We had some incredible panels here today, and I'm excited to be talking about securing the digital economy with two amazing speakers. We have Joe Blankenship. He is the co-founder and chief data officer at Certus Core, where he leads data operations and ontology engineering for their semantic knowledge graphs, SKJ, platform. With a background in electronic engineering, geospatial data science, and financial economics, Joe is also a passionate community organizer. He leads the Tampa Bay Data Center Engineering and Python user groups and has founded several technology organizations across Florida and Kentucky. Thank you, Joe, for being here. Next, we have Gabe Higgins. He has been a leader in the Bitcoin space since 2012, helping shape the future of decentralized finance and enterprise blockchain infrastructure. As CTO officer at Blockspaces, he drives product strategy, systems architecture, and spearheading platforms like Arc, a Bitcoin native collateral management system, and Fusion, which connects blockchain networks with traditional finance systems. Gabe specializes in translating complex Bitcoin and Lightning Network technologies into scalable institutional-grade financial solutions. Thank you, Gabe, for being here.
Good to be here.
Yeah. So next we have our USF policy proposer, Alex Vu. He's a junior at USF, double majoring in econometrics and political science. He currently serves as a spring 2025 young professional in East-West Center in Washington, where he engages in policy research and international affairs. So thank you, Alex, for being here. And whenever you're ready, feel free.
Thank you, Samhi. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I just want to start off by saying thank you to the GNSI and the FSP for hosting this wonderful conference. It's an amazing opportunity to sit with my panelists, and I really hope that it sets the stage for upcoming events in the future. And so prop to you, GNSI and FSP. And thank you, Samhi, for the introduction, very kind introduction. I just want to start off with a disclaimer. As Samhi mentioned, my background is in economics and political science, so I am in no way possible of having enough knowledge and expertise in terms of technology, and my knowledge of the field is confined to the 2 semesters of computer science that I study here before I dropped out. So gotta say that first. I am extremely sorry for anything stupid I'm gonna say in the next hour. I want to say my policy proposal, or not necessarily proposal, but rather there are questions. Questions to be answered, questions that we all need to take a look at, not just here today in this panel, but also for the audience and a wider public group, I'll say that. So my policy essentially focuses, my proposal focuses on our economy today and what we're going to do in order to prevent the cyber attacks that we're seeing that is actually coming more and more frequent, and to sort of negate the impacts they can have on our society. So when we think about the U.S. economy today and the amount of digitalization and the amount of interconnectedness that we have, it's huge. It plays a huge role into our economy. And when we talk about the digital economy, it's not just about the Grubhub, the Uber, the Amazon that you guys are using every day, but it's also about this institution, the networks that major companies are using like the SWIFT system that we have to transfer money, for example, the same system that a lot of these major institutions are using, ranging from big tech to companies like Boeing, to big banks like Goldman Sachs. So a lot of that. And I just want to point it out how, cyber attacks have been severely affecting our economy. I have a couple of numbers here. According to the FBI 2023 Internet Crime Report, U.S. businesses and individuals lost over $12.5 billion in that year alone due to cyber attacks. And I just want to point out a couple of examples. In 2021, the ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline disrupted fuel supplies to the southeastern United States. That included the state of Florida. And in 2023, the ransomware group Clop exploited a zero-day vulnerability in the MOVEit transfer tool, compromising sensitive data from numerous federal agencies, including the Department of Energy. So these attacks are real. We have seen that, and they have tremendous effect on our society. But the question here is, what are we doing in order to negate these sort of attacks and in order to prevent the horrible outcomes that we suspected? So we have a lot of, we mentioned today across many panels on the NIST and how they create these foundations for us to have a more secure digital economy. My question is that do we need to have a federal agency that are more focused on civilian cyber attack, more focused on attacks on our financial institution as well as our economy? We have agencies like the NSA that are more sort of militarized. We have the US Cyber Command, which are more militarized. We have agencies like the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, with DHS, but we do not have, as of today, an agency that focuses primarily on civilian attacks or attacks on our economy and financial institution. So first question here that my policy proposal aims to solve is that do we need one? And if we do have one, what is it going to look like? How are we going to approach this? And the second thing is that at the same time, how are these federal agencies going to detect attacks and making sure that we have countermeasures before these attacks create bigger outcomes? So I want to point out, I want to take this example of weather control. I'll take that. It's not a perfect example, but I'll try to. So we have agency like the NOAA that detects weather problems, that detects storms, hurricanes, and notified the public if they're coming. So should we have this sort of agency for cyber attacks as well when we notice a sort of surge in network usage or DDoS attacks on companies? And then we can also make a wider report or even countermeasure immediately before the outcomes starting to appear. Now, there are, of course, a lot of problems with this approach. First is technological constraint. How can you do that as well? It's very difficult. Secondly, it's also coming from an economic and political perspective. Are companies even going to report these attacks in the first place? So, for example, if Boeing got attacked by a ransomware group today, are they going to handle it quietly by themselves, or are they going to report it to federal agencies so that they can prevent similar attacks? Because if they do that, if it go public, then their stock would fall. And that you're going to see economic consequences to that even before these cyber attacks starting to appear. So these are questions that we need to consider as well. And the second part to my policy proposal is how we can integrate new technologies, as we mentioned a lot, like blockchain, AI, and especially the previous panel as mentioned, quantum computing, into our federal agencies as well as our economic institutions that we have today. You know, we have mentioned a lot about Bitcoin, how it can become a sort of currency that replaces the traditional currency that we've been having. But you know, those talks have been going on for almost 10 years now. Is that finally going to happen or not? That's also a question we need to consider. And as technologies like blockchain, for example, which is great because of its decentralization, but at the same time, this sort of decentralization is an obstacle when it comes to federal agency. They want everything to be centralized so that they can control. So what are we going to do when we have this sort of conflict between the nature of the technology as well as the political interests and the political constraints? So these are all questions that I believe that are critical that we need to consider right now, and I hope that's set up a good foundation for the talk that we're going to have today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. Do you guys have any thoughts?
Yeah, there was a lot there to chew on, Alex. I'll start with the, you know, as far as securing the digital economy, of course, my experience is with cryptocurrencies, which are fundamentally based on cryptography. So a lot of these questions around security, preventing attacks for just from ransomware to the structure of the cryptocurrency mechanism themselves being secured by cryptography that could be impeded by quantum at some point. You know, these are all very relevant questions, and to Roger's point in the last panel, he spoke about, you know, the fact that Bitcoin gets hacked at this point is kind of irrelevant to the global security of the financial infrastructure today. So these are questions and concerns that impact everybody equally, I think. So I think utilizing these new technologies in a way that helps systemic risk be mitigated, and also identify those risks, attack vectors as well, so we can mitigate those attacks is imperative to our underlying infrastructure as a whole. So these are the very things that me and my company Blockspaces are utilizing infrastructure, new financial infrastructure such as Bitcoin, which is at this point the world's most secure financial network on the planet. And I think that is why it should be utilized to do global finance in a way that isn't really possible with the legacy framework and apparatus that we've been using. And of course, we've seen plenty of instances where that infrastructure has been compromised or attacked, and that will just continue to accelerate until we move to more secure infrastructure.
Joe, any thoughts?
I guess just my initial thoughts are, the convergence of, financial technologies and regulation. I'm not a big fan of regulating stuff before we understand what we're regulating. So when it comes to addressing issues with technology, it's very important, just as a very brief intro is, I guess my input for this overall panel is that we shouldn't rush to implement a technological fix before we understand the full scope of the additional problem that necessitated the implementation of the technological fix. You don't want to a priori assume that you understand what the solution is before you actually understand the full context of the financial problem. And a lot of those problems are human-based, as the previous panels have discussed. So I guess that'd be my overall preface for future questions. Yeah.
Thank you. And that's perfect to lead on to this next discussion. Before we begin, though, we are going to be allowing people to ask questions during the panel. You guys know the drill. Raise your hands, and we'll have someone give you a microphone. So on your note, Joe, you talked about, understanding the full context of the situation. FinTech has evolved from a niche concept into a driving force behind global economic change. How would you describe FinTech's most transformative impact, not just on financial systems, but also on how people relate to money itself?
The major thing that I've noticed with financial technology and people is kind of the relationship between how they think about money and how they actually apply monetary practices. If you reference Thomas Friedman, the world's flat, it's like financial technology has opened the playing field for a lot of people that were previously excluded or people that had challenges integrating themselves with pre-existing economic activities. But the problem is that now that they're rushing into these activities, now they're rushing in there with new ideas about how monetary things work and how they integrate themselves into those practices. So when it comes to the impact of FinTech, it's an exacerbation of that problem. You have people that are rushing to apply things and get money into certain places without understanding the ramifications of what that money does once it's in those places. So that leads to not just a lot of legitimate mistakes that go on inside these things, but also, they burgeon on gray market activities of unintended consequences of money going to these spaces and being injected into practices that they're not fully aware of on the back end of that nice user experience on the front end of things. Bitcoin experienced that a lot early on. It was a great technology, got used in a lot of unintended ways, even though it's still a legitimate economic system that can be used for legitimate purposes. But the same thing has happened with US dollars. US dollars are all around the world. They're a global currency. They're the foundation of almost all indexes and markets. So when you look at the impact of US dollars, the majority of the uses are legitimate, but it does fund a lot of illegitimate activities as well. So when it comes down to FinTech, it's about not just what people do with the money, but it's how they think about what money is when they're using it.
Very well said, very well said. And, in terms of, FinTech, we hear disruption. It's a term that's often used a lot. And Gabe, in your point of view, what truly defines FinTech as a disruptive force, and what systematic changes do you still see in the future on the horizon?
Yeah, that kind of varies it depends on the institutions, right? We work with primarily institutions, legacy institutions that saying disruptive technology is actually very scary to them. They want stability, predictability, things that don't rock the boat primarily. So I think there's a lot, there's good reason for that, and also that also kind of, doesn't enable them to be as innovative as they could, right? Adopting these, the latest and greatest technologies, even for security reasons, is still kind of like a slow moving, trying to turn a ship. So I think it's primarily driven through necessity, and unfortunately that comes with pain. So until the vulnerabilities are like explicit or being actually taken advantage of, that pain exists and is real, then they'll put the effort to changing the current way. But yeah, so it depends. It depends on the institution, how forward-thinking they are, how innovative that they're allowing themselves to be, and there's lots of systems that you also have to, either replace or, help substantiate the difference between these new technologies and how they can bolster or complement the existing frameworks versus ripping and replacing it with something totally new that they're not familiar with, and that's really disruptive, but it could also disrupt their entire business model too. So there's a balance there that needs to be stricken.
Interesting. So for all the students here who may not have a big background in fintech and what exactly it is and what will the future with it look like, could both of you kind of just give us some context on what we need to know for future, especially as a student?
Yeah, that's pretty broad, because I mean, fintech, what that even is changing, right, constantly, right, as all technology. So if it's technology, it's changing. So that means there's always something new that's coming into the pipeline and something new to test, to help secure, or find the vulnerabilities. So that's a constant game that's being played, a cat and mouse game that we have with technology. So that's no different with fintech. You can arguably it's even more important because you're dealing with assets and money and people's value and how that's being secured and transferred and et cetera. So there's a lot of work to be done in this sector, forever, right? This is always going to be evolving as long as technology is itself evolving. So you have to be adaptable. You have to, like many of the other panelists today have said, you have to always be learning. You have to be in a learning mode constantly and inquisitive. You have to understand what's coming down the pike and seeing what is ahead. Even, we're talking about quantum, even though, it was made pretty clear by the last panel that it's not really a threat today, but it could be in the future, right? So we want to pay attention to what's going on and kind of read the tea leaves on how that sector is developing and maturing, because when technology hits, right, it comes in fits and waves. So when it's there, it's obvious, but it obviously took some time to get there. But just paying attention to those trends is very key and important. But you never know when it's going to actually really hit. So being very prudent about how you're paying attention is important.
No, that's well said. And the only thing I would probably add to that is that understanding that financial technologies, we have to be clear about what financial technology are. Like, back in the day, clay tokens were an innovation in how we exchange things between each other, or seashells. We're just, we're continuing on those trends, but we're just using computers to do them now more so than ever. And I guess the one addition that I would add would be that really, when we're talking about keeping your eye on fintech, you're dealing with generational problems. Like, older generations have a very different relationship with technology and finance than younger generations do. With younger generations, they're born into using smart devices and mobile banking and ubiquitous computer just around you all the time. So there's always going to be a lag in generational consideration in terms of not just usage, but also security practices. When you talk about identity theft, a lot of that happens with older people in places that are more remote, where those people just don't use computers much, but their identities are still in systems that hold digital signatures of their identity. So when you're looking at financial technology and where that's going, also keep in mind that there is a physical footprint of people and places and things that are interacting with those digital systems that need to be accounted for when considering the security utilization of those systems long term.
And so we talk about the digital economy, Joe. We've had this conversation about, the future and digital economy. And we're seeing 4 key areas of impact. We have labor shifts, we have the skill training gap, evolving security needs, and changing regulatory demands. Could you expand on how each of these areas are being affected and which you believe presents the biggest opportunity or challenge in the future?
I think the biggest thing now is, I think everybody's hit on already, is AI. Like, AI is impacting pretty much every part of the digital economy at this point, how we're kind of approaching quick fixes that have existed, and now we're trying to patch them over with AI. And to previous comments, we should really try to understand the fundamentals of the problem sans technology. Is the human problem that we're trying to solve before trying to put technology and then AI on top of that. But with labor, like I said, AI is going to shift a lot of white-collar labor. However, it's not a bad thing. It's going to accelerate a lot of practices that have already been kind of standardized. And that's going to mean there's going to be opportunities for new functionality within organizations, not so much in terms of like job loss. There's just be job replacement, which means the skill retraining around how AI enables certain practices are going to be vital moving forward, especially in the next 5 to 10 years. And once again, this is rough estimates. I'm not prognosticating anything at this point, but it's one of those things where I look at fintech. I look at the most ubiquitous type of fintech, and that's Excel. Excel spreadsheets are everywhere. They're still going to be everywhere. AI is going to be further integrated into Excel. So it's not that Excel, people that don't know how to use Excel are going to go anywhere. It's just people are going to be using AI to do Excel stuff faster and better. And that's going to be the majority of the trend across most fintech and most digital economy type practice areas. And in terms of, what were the last two?
It was regulatory demands and evolving security needs.
Oh, well, I think Gabe's hit most of the security needs. Regulatory stuff is going to be the same regulatory problems we always have. We're going to have an emergent technology. Organizations are going to try and regulate it ahead of understanding how the technology works. And then 10 years later, we're going to finally understand how the technology works. And then regulatory stuff's going to have to be reformed because they regulated it too soon. So I would assume that trend's going to continue on as we move forward with most digital economy stuff and how financial technology kind of balances those risk metrics with that.
Gabe, do you have any opinions on kind of where you see, the digital economy in the future and its ripple effects?
Yeah, lots of opinions on that. Obviously, I'm very bullish on Bitcoin myself. I have been for a while now, but it seems the world has finally come my way and seeing things the way I see it. But I think that's going to, a continued trend. The technology has now proven itself sound now for, a decade and a half, and I think that is now proliferating worldwide, globally, and I think that's just going to continue to happen. So I think as far as like digital assets and securing the digital economy itself, I think that, obviously digital assets are going to be a big part of that, if not a majority of that in the future, certainly, as we've seen how digital information has assumed the role from traditional analog information being distributed. Obviously, a global distributed internet helped information proliferate. I think the same will be with digital assets and how value is transferred across the globe instantaneously with these digital assets. So I think that's going to be a big part of how that future kind of develops. We're watching it happen in real time right now, and I think makes it very exciting. We live in a very interesting times.
Oh, for sure, especially with all the different things going on. Joe, did you have something else to say?
Yeah, once again, I'll bolster Gabe's enthusiasm for decentralized technologies by saying that you got to keep in mind where Bitcoin emerged from. Bitcoin emerged from a financial crisis where it wasn't like a cybersecurity type, it was more of a societal security concern. And in 2009, this system just kind of emerged as an alternative to traditional, monetary systems. And then people started really asking, people that had never thought of an alternative to the US dollar, now they had a truly different alternative that was just as viable. And once again, it wasn't worth much when it first started out, but that quickly changed as people started getting in there and started asking questions about the system itself. And I think that's really the ripple effect of Bitcoin and decentralized technologies, is that people start asking better questions about the systems they already use and preconceived notions of how they've been using it. And I think that's the strength of perpetuating these types of efforts, block spaces and what they've been doing, is the fact that they've been forcing people to really answer questions that are very uncomfortable about financial realities that face everybody in our society, and not just a few people that are interested in a bespoke monetary system. So
it forces you to ask these hard questions, right? And kind of reset your baseline thinking on where your precepts were, right? So you got to fundamentally change your mindset when you discover these new systems, these new technologies, and how they change the way things used to be or how you thought they worked to what the new reality is. So there's a constant reframing that needs to happen. And of course, you got to be flexible enough in your thinking to adapt as well.
Yeah, and the result of that is that people, by asking better questions, ask better security questions about how can we all do this more safely.
Speaking of security, decentralized finance, what can you guys tell me about it, and why is it such a big deal?
Yeah, it's a big deal, for the reasons we've been talking about, right? It's democratizing access to a financial sector that didn't exist before or had very constrained, limited access. And it really cuts out a lot of the middlemen involved in the accessing of either capital or exchanging value. So it's a really, again, it's like a game changer. As the way the internet has proliferated, the value of transmitting communications and information, this is a new system to communicate and transfer value across these distributed systems without any intermediaries in between. They usually take a big percentage cut on that value itself. So it's value savings mechanism, it's a security mechanism as well, and it proliferates the access on a global basis. So it's a really big deal. It's a game-changing idea, and like I said, we're seeing that kind of evolve in real time from something that was very niche with only the nerdy types being involved in the early days to now it's essentially like a globally recognized system that is being more and more utilized, not only on a peer-to-peer level, but now on a nation-state level, where you have economies that are developing around it in either third world countries like El Salvador to the United States just declaring a national Bitcoin reserve, strategic reserve. We're holding Bitcoin as a treasury reserve assets. We're seeing that with corporations as well and other institutions that are starting to do the same, because this is an asset class that can't be fundamentally corrupted by certain powers that be that we've seen other financial systems succumb to. So I think it's a really big deal.
Mm-hmm. And Alex, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I thank you, Gabe and Joe. I think there's poses a lot of questions in these cases as well. Regarding Bitcoin and the decentralization of finance, of course, as Joe mentioned and Gabe as well, has bring this sort of democratization into our economy, and it stemmed from the 2008 financial crisis. It showcased sort of this reflect in psychology in terms of how people have this distrust of the US dollar in particular and the financial institutions that have been around for a very long time. Yet, I also feel we've been talking about Bitcoin possibility of becoming a currency that can go into everyday lives. We've been having this talk for a very long time. Yet, as of today, 2025, which is more than 10 to 15 years since Bitcoin started taking off and started getting that reputation, we haven't seen it translate into our daily life yet. And Bitcoin is still being used very limited as a transaction tool, being used very limited as a sort of asset that people can profiteer on. And also back to your point that you mentioned that, that it's getting more popular and more seen as an asset that people should hold. But at the same time, when you think about it, El Salvador is the only country, I believe, with a couple of other more, I might be wrong in here, but that acknowledge Bitcoin. We don't have that many countries, and especially in the top performing, the leading economies of the world, we're not seeing that yet. And the second thing is that you mentioned how Bitcoin, the price of the asset are not being easily conflated or controlled by different institutions, the same way gold can be, or even oil with OPEC in Russia and all these countries. But is it true? Because we have witnessed over the last 10 years how Bitcoin prices really change over time. And so these are the questions that I feel like we also need to reconsider. And from another point of view is that the reason we have institutions like the US dollar exists because it also exudes a political power in itself. Reason why countries are not easy to let them go is that it's another political tool for them to control what's going on as well. So we're definitely seeing how all of these are colliding into each other. And of course, it's be very fun to see how they would play out in the future. But at the same time, me personally, I will have to challenge Gabe on that point.
Yeah, those challenge accepted. Those are great questions and ones that we're constantly asking, and the answer is actually constantly evolving. The reality is we've throughout the history of the world, we've never seen a novel asset class evolve from a technology-based system. This is the first. So I think as a species, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but we're also struggling to really assess the actual value. So to your question of why it's so volatile, that's why. We have no idea what this thing is worth. And so the market is trying to assess that constantly. And to that end, we've also seen the accumulation of value in this asset class just skyrocket over the last decade, right? So if you would have told me 10 years ago that the United States would have declared a strategic Bitcoin reserve and that we would have nations that were declaring it as legal tender, I would have thought you were nuts. And I was a big, advocate for this. But that was just such a pipe dream that wasn't even part of the conversation, maybe in 100 years, but not in 10 years. So I think we're seeing it evolve much more rapidly than we could even, understand back then. So I think a lot of that is just human nature and trying to evaluate what this thing is that has now been created and now persists, has accumulated over $2 trillion and secured $2 trillion. That's another thing that I think we have to really grapple with, is that this is holding real value, right? So if there was a way to compromise the system, it would have made itself known by now, right? Or you would think, because anybody who could have access to the $2 trillion honeypot probably would have, right? So that actually goes to bolster the case that no, this is a real novel thing that has been created and that's useful and that and can be used for these other mechanisms. I think as far as transactional, like you said, it's perceived that Bitcoin is not used for payments, but that's not necessarily true, right? I mean, we can see the transactions on chain. The chain's full all the time. So that means it's being utilized to a degree where it's actually, there's a scaling problem with Bitcoin as far as the transaction throughput. And that's being mitigated by other layers built on top of the protocol, which is what we work with as well. So I think those are, those are technological issues that are being solved, right? So that's part of the excitement to me about this whole thing evolving, is that we get to solve these kinds of problems, right? And there's lots of opportunity with that as well. So, to Joe's point, right, with all of these technology advancements, although it seems to eliminate some jobs, like we talk about the getting rid of the middlemen with these distributed systems, it also creates new opportunities as well. So I think there's a give and take there that is often missed. We think it's either black or white or one or the other, and that's not necessarily the case. As we've seen, as with all technology, it helps humanity flourish in some ways, or most ways. Most technologies that are useful stick around, and the ones that don't, fall by the wayside. So I think a lot of these issues that you raise will be more obvious over time, that it'll take care of itself, essentially, is what I believe, because like I said, watching this thing grow from essentially nothing to nobody knew what it was, to now the whole world is talking about it, and having some kind of strategy around it or developing that is kind of mind-blowing to me. So I think it's actually evolving rather rapidly, certainly faster than I could have predicted.
I think one little small add to that. I think that to address both these points into the initial question is that there is this weird defining of decentralized economies by this gray regulatory space, because these systems are largely regulated by their artifacts and not the systems themselves. Anybody in here can download the open source software and start your own cryptocurrency blockchain today if you wanted to. But the thing that is being regulated and touching real economies are the artifacts of these systems, the cryptocurrencies that are being exchanged for US dollars or euros, et cetera, so forth. And that's why countries like Venezuela and Argentina have used these not just for remittances, but also for securitizing themselves against rapid inflation. So, it's that concern, when I was working on certain projects regarding, treasury-based stuff and identifying, illicit patterns, we were always asked to look at cryptocurrency, but those were never the key indicators of any kind of bad activity. It was always activities that were found in traditional digital economy systems, using traditional financial technologies that were used, monitored for artifacts and then identified for this person did something illegal. Like cryptocurrencies rarely played a part in that thing. And it's just because those artifacts are rarely used by people, and when they are, they're mostly used for legitimate, very apparent purposes, because companies like Chainalysis, their whole purpose is curating data for Bitcoin transactions and layering those things with information about who on the blockchain is doing what. And it's just bolstered the legitimacy, and at the end of the day, for things like Bitcoin, like Ethereum, like all these other types of Web 3.0 technologies. And it's only helped the legitimacy of how these things are going to be regulated into the future and make them much more viable as valuable assets that are less prone to volatility.
The long and short of that is, if you're planning on doing illicit activity, you probably shouldn't put that transaction on a distributed ledger system that lives forever. Just putting that out there.
It'll catch up to you. So, kind of to touch upon what both of you guys have been saying, the digital economy, it's a global economy. The regulation of different countries, how readily, some countries adopt it, depends on, like Venezuela, depends on, protection against inflation and such as different scenarios like that. So in terms of regulation, as different regions take distinct regulatory approaches, China's assertiveness, the EU's caution, we have kind of a fragmented pace, correct me if I'm wrong. What do these global differences signal about who's going to lead in setting the rules of the digital economy and kind of digital finance? And what does that mean for cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think from a regulatory standpoint, it's certainly been the case in the U.S. That there's been fits and starts, right? It varies from administration to administration, it turns out. But I think what we're starting to see, certainly from the last administration, was, I would say, very hostile. Being in the industry, we felt like it was very hostile to this particular asset class, whereas this administration seems more open to it. And actually, I'm right after this, where I'm headed to Tallahassee to speak with state regulators and legislators about digital assets and how that plays a role in the statewide economy. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. You know, us at Block Spaces, we've always been kind of forward facing with you know, trying to meet the regulators where they are and the legislators, and understanding that, you know, this technology is in a very nascent stage still, and that you know, to see the good with the bad. You know, they usually typically only see the bad, but we like to point out the good things, and that there's a lot of businesses here in the state that are providing really you know, good use cases, opportunities, high-paying jobs in the technical sector as well, driving those jobs here in the Florida economy and helping bolster that economy. So I think you know, doing that is going to continue to be important, and you know, there's a lot of folks in the industry that have also been very active in that regard as well. So hopefully we see that change, you know, in a more you know, sustainable way in the future as well. It's been, you know, very rocky road, but I would expect nothing different from regulators in general. They're not technologists by and large. They're mostly lawyers. So we'll see. We'll do our best though.
When it comes to like regional emergencies of how digital economy manifests, I think like globally we're all kind of connected. Like, you know, the US dollar is just there and it kind of backs everything. And, you know, the BRICS nations have tried to find alternatives. They just haven't successfully found one yet. Cryptocurrencies are probably the closest thing to it in terms of global acceptance of like, this could be an alternative, but because of regulatory issues and because of other concerns that they have just as smaller economies, they're worried about being squashed by bigger economies. So still that classic paradigm persists. But I think just regionally speaking, like I think all of them want to do stuff, but they have very different perspectives on what they want done. You know, in terms of like the EU, it seems like in terms of digital economy, they're very concerned about securing personal identity and personal security for their citizenry. Like they want to make sure that identity theft is very hard to, you know, do, and make sure that, you know, there's no kind of financial repercussions that are, you know, achieved by that kind of vulnerability. The U.S. seems very determined to secure the U.S. dollar, secure U.S. markets, because we do underpin most of the global economy. So in China, they seem very persistently engaged with using digital economy to securitize supply chains. They want to be the provider for most of the global, you know, the Silk Road initiative. You think about their, you know, penetration into Central Africa continent writ large, South and Central America. They're very interested in making sure that they are the, you know, the shippers and suppliers of, you know, materials and goods to the world. So I think because of those interests and because of how they enforce those things politically, militarily, that their utilization and evolution of digital economy are going to be very different, and are going to continue to be very different in their, you know, smaller spaces, but then also how they butt up against other regional concerns and how they're providing and changing and shifting and guiding digital economy. So.
And I would love to take a jab at that question as well. I love how you mentioned, how you phrased the question as who's going to lead the race in this digital economy. Well, I would love to bring this out because it goes right into my alley of international relations, was that there's this growing consensus amongst our scholars is that the international studies of the 21st century is not simply on countries and nations anymore, not about nation states, but about international corporations as well. These multinational corporations with interests, with assets, with personnel across the world, ranging from many countries to another, and they play a big role. Now we're not seeing countries trade in digitalized currency yet, but who says corporations cannot? We definitely can see multinational corporations doing that. And answering your question, I think the ones that are leading this race are not countries, but rather corporations, multinational corporation, and they are definitely leading this race. They're setting games, and it's not just about the economy as well, but about how we see this international order. It's not about nation state anymore, but about the role of these different types of players, and corporations being one of them.
That is a very, very interesting perspective. I'd agree with that, especially as a student, you know. we can see big changes happening, and you guys are experiencing it. And we're going to go into the future, into a generation where it is being led by MNCs, multinational corporations. And, you know, the digital economy is, we're being more connected and connected in the future. So in that case, you know, as this space evolves faster and faster now that we have AI and more technologies that build upon each other, adaptation becomes more valuable than expertise. What career adaptability, what does that look like in the future in the digital first economy? And how can we as individuals, also as students, but also institutions, build it into our DNA? How can we build that kind of forward-facing, you know, culture?
Yeah, I think, you know, luckily this younger generation are already kind of digitally natives, right? You're used to adapting the latest and greatest technologies, right? Faster internet, broadband service, or the latest iPhone or MacBook or whatever. That's just kind of like built in now, right? We want the thing to be faster, smarter, cheaper. So I think that will, as long as you're adapting with that, I think you're going to be fine. The same applies to any other application technology as well, like we're talking about, whether it be digital assets, cybersecurity, AI, quantum, whatever. It's all kind of progressing in the same way, right? So as long as you're, you know, prone to adapt with the changing technologies, I think that's what you just continue to do. And I think that's kind of already built in your DNA as being digital natives. So just keep doing that.
I would agree with all those points. I would also say that, you know, to points made earlier in other panels, it's like just getting as many perspectives in the room as possible on how they're leveraging it, because no two people you leverage these technologies the same, even if they're in the same room. So it's important to get as many perspectives on what is novel to them about these things and how those interstitial spaces could foment some kind of emergent technology down the road. Because, you know, plenty of innovation has been made by using the same technology multiple times and figuring out, like, okay, this is one thing I wish this thing could do better. And then that's the next leap that would take people to the next stage in digital economy or fintech and what people do with fintech. The underlying core technologies of blockchain technologies, those were around for a very long time before blockchain was even a thing. But it just took one event for people to combine 4 different technologies into a single thing, and then we had to do a whole new sector to look at in terms of digital economy. So, and that will continue to be the trend. So adaptability came down to being able to, you know, get as many perspectives on patterns as possible and figuring out when to break a pattern to find something new. Because you never know what's going to happen, but having that adaptability and that vigilance to really see these things for what they are in terms of systems and being able to break them down to foment something new that's more constructive for the collective is what it's all about.
Yeah, that's a good, to piggyback on what Joe just said, you know, realizing that a lot of these technologies aren't like, you know, being developed in silos, right? They're not mutually exclusive to each other, right? There's going to be combinations where this is a strength in this area, this is a strength in this area. So if I combine it in this unique combination, then we get this new thing, this new system that, you know, wasn't even thought of. So I think looking for those kinds of opportunities is also key, because that's how all of technology develops anyway, right? These systems built on other systems. So that evolutionary process is kind of happening all the time with technology. So paying attention to where that's going is you know, key.
And in terms of paying attention, is there anything that we need to pay attention to, you know, be cautious of? Is there something that we need to kind of be a little more wary of when it comes to these technologies?
Yeah, with all technologies, right, that can be used for good things and bad things. So being aware of the bad things and how to protect yourself is obviously very important. So, you know, I've gotten bitten by being in this industry plenty, you know, so taking security seriously is going to be more and more imperative. But, you know, also just being just broadly aware of that is where you're gonna need to pay attention, and it's not going to be easy, but that's where a lot of that learning process you put into action is important.
I would say security in the digital economy is the same as security anywhere. Just obey the fundamentals. Good passwords, good multi-factor authentication. Shifting when there's better security paradigms. Shift those new paradigms. Don't wait to switch. Don't wait to update your passwords. Don't wait. Don't share your stuff. Just the same thing you would do to protect your personal stuff. Just extend that to practices inside of fintech and digital economy.
So don't use the same password for everything.
There you go.
That's very important. A lot of people don't do that still. I know some people. Yeah.
And I just want to say approach the question from a different perspective, and I believe Joe touched on it at the beginning of how digitalized economy has really changed our relationship with money in particular, and with the economy and with finance in general. Now we're going to see, this is a small example of how you see older generation when they're going to use cash, they're going to use coins to pay for what they're doing, and somewhat that makes them more conservative every time they're about to pay for something, they're about to buy something, the sheer physical act of pulling your wallet out and pulling out $10, $20 stops you from buying something, rather than you just pull out your phone, you tap it without you even looking at it. So it changed our relationship with money a lot. This is a psychological problem that we also need to look at. And at the same time, we need to remind ourselves that technology changed, but money do not. Money remains the same thing, whether it's thousands of years ago we used shelves to exchange goods, or now we use bitcoins to pay for whatever we want. So, the medium can change, but the nature of it doesn't, and it's very important to remember that as well, that psychological relationship.
That is a great point. So to close, what is one lesson you've learned from navigating your own career that might help others, whether they're students or seasoned professionals? How do you guys prefer to stay ready for the digital economy in the future?
You got to stay hungry and be resilient. That's the key things, I think. That's what, if I wasn't that, I wouldn't be in this industry. I mean, you got to love what you do, right? So you want to have an innate interest in what you're doing, have a passion for it, have a drive, and then just get into that industry in any way possible to start, right? As soon as possible. Doing the most mundane thing, it doesn't matter. You just get your foot in the door, and then it'll evolve from there. If your passion will show through, and then that will help advance your career.
I would say ask why until you get to a better question. If the focus is security, you don't want to, neglect really digging into something until it's uncomfortable. So until people are like, okay, we admit there's probably a bigger problem here than we've initially addressed. So ask why until people start getting disgruntled and you have a better question, and then you might have something that is better to be actioned at that point. Never assume that you kind of know the problem up front. You have to dig into it. And technology is essentially the perfect example of that. Like, everybody assumes they have the requirements the first time, and it never happens. Requirements usually evolve over years until you get the thing you actually wanted to build. So
join the FSP and participate in events like this.
Exactly. Coming to events like this, you really get to learn so much. Didn't even know what quantum computing was before this. Now I know that I need to search it up on YouTube. All right. Well, thank you so much to both of you, to Alex, Joe, Gabe. Thank you so much for being here. This has been an amazing discussion. And yeah, we're ready to conclude.
Thanks.